Welcome in. Hi, atop a Tuesday night here live from Houston, Texas. Welcome in to the 21st edition of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports. That is right. It's the 21st edition live on the Raw Prospect Podcast YouTube channel, home of the Raw Prospect Podcast, Amy and I's podcast, where we talk sports about twice a week, possibly even more than that. The 21st edition of my show today. We have a ton to talk about. We're going to be live again tomorrow for our 22nd edition before Emmy and I take a long weekend. I have some family stuff planned this weekend, so I won't be able to get behind the microphone and talk about the Texas Longhorns. This is Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports. If you enjoy the content, make sure you like and subscribe to our channel as it says at the bottom of your screen. We would greatly appreciate that. We also would greatly appreciate your feedback. Whether that be content related, you want to give your opinions on what we talked about. Maybe you want to give your opinions on your team or whatever it might be. Or you want to give us suggestions for what we should talk about or how we can improve our content or how I can improve this particular show. Let me know. I would greatly appreciate it as long as it's constructive criticism. But we got a lot to talk about right now, so we're going to dive right in. Thank you. If you're tuning in live, make sure you use the comment section to ask your questions, put in your opinions, your comments, and I will read them live on the show as they come in. Tonight, we're going to be going for about 45, 50 minutes, hopefully. Tomorrow, we'll go a little longer. We've got, I wouldn't say a loaded Week 5 slate in college football, but it is a good slate. It's a very good slate in college football. It's not lackluster, not at all. It might not be what last week was, and man, last week lived up to the hype. But it's a really good slate in college football. We'll talk about that tomorrow. We'll talk more about Texas-Kansas in particular, this upcoming game, which I don't think can be overlooked. And there are some other good matchups as well. We'll talk more about the state of this Texas football team and the outlook for the rest of the season. Particularly, I guess, this game and then next week, which will be a big week of shows because it's Red River Week. So hope you guys like and enjoy all the content. Again, if you're tuned in live, make sure you put in your comments, participate in the chat, like the video, do what you need to do. We greatly appreciate it. I wanted to start today's show with just a quick news bit from today as it pertains to Texas athletics, and this time the Texas basketball program. We haven't talked basketball on this show, and as I've mentioned before, we're going to start beginning tomorrow getting into 1 to 2 teams, 1 to 2 programs per podcast from here on out through the month of October until we get to the college basketball season to kind of preview the season. We'll be talking about conferences, players, teams, all that sort of stuff for the top-rated programs and even some frisky bubble teams possibly. So make sure you tune in to our shows as if you are a big college basketball fan or interested in any of those teams, you can, of course, find my previews for those teams and what I think about those teams going into the college basketball season, as we are about approximately 40-ish days away from that tipping off, which is exciting. I know football is the only thing on a lot of people's minds right now, but college football season, we're already a third of the way through technically. We're already through 4 weeks. I know it's a little longer than 12 weeks technically, but every team plays 12 games. All the teams have played about 4 games, so we're technically about 33% of the way there. It goes by pretty fast. It'll be there before you know it. It'll be in conference championship weekend. So if you love college sports truly like I do, and you love college basketball, especially March Madness, I think that'll be interesting content for you guys. We'll talk about Texas, of course, probably more so than any other team. But, I mean, Kansas is loaded. Houston is loaded. Lots of other teams are very talented. We'll talk about the Final Four teams from last year and all the blue bloods, all that sort of stuff. We'll key you in for college basketball season. That way, when those early season games hit around Thanksgiving and we got a lot of ranked matchups going on, you'll be like, oh, Michael mentioned that on his podcast that Hunter Dickinson transferred into Kansas. And oh, there he is. He just put up 20-10 against Gonzaga or whatever it might be. You'll know. That's what we try to do here. We want to have fun. I want to give you my opinions, my thoughts on Texas athletics, as I like to think I'm pretty informed. I mean, I'm on all the message boards. I'm reading everything that I can on the Texas football team, on the Texas athletics program. And I watch a lot of college football and college basketball. So I like to think I know some things. I don't claim to be an expert, but I want to be able to give you my opinions, give you my perspective, give you what I think of certain things, and hopefully you learn something. Hopefully you can interact, and hopefully you have fun listening. And if you don't, well, tell me how I can improve. But the news bit of today was that the Big 12, and keep in mind, it's not just Texas and OU's last year in the SEC for football. Last year in the Big 12. They're going to the SEC. It's their last year for everything. Baseball, every sport. They'll also be moving to the SEC in basketball next year. This is the last year in the Big 12, which in my opinion has been maybe not by far and away. There are really good conferences out there. I mean, the SEC has slowly risen over the past couple of years, but the top of the Big Ten is pretty damn good. The Big East, I think, would probably have a pretty good argument for top to bottom being the second best league, but I think the Big 12 has been the best league in college basketball for at least the past half decade. It kind of took that title from the ACC 4 or 5 years ago, in my opinion. Just with the breadth and the depth of the conference, top to bottom, with teams like Texas and Texas Tech and TCU, at the middle of the conference, kind of rising to the occasion and becoming really good programs that can make runs to the second weekend of the tournament and even maybe get to the Final Four. I think the Big 12 has been the best conference, and it got better because, as we know, the Big 12 has added Houston. The Big 12 has added BYU. It's added Cincinnati. It's added UCF. Those are some good basketball programs. Particularly Houston is the one you probably think about the most. And so it's a new basketball schedule, right? Texas won't have the round robin with all other 9 teams like they usually do. Since the other 4 teams were added, the schedule's a little different this year. And we're just looking at the conference portion of their upcoming basketball schedule. So their last run through the Big 12, this is what the conference basketball schedule looks like. It was just released, I believe, this morning. Conference play usually starts beginning of January, right at the new year. That's when college basketball goes into conference play. Then you have 2 full months of conference play, January, February, and early March, before we get into conference tournaments. And then we have Selection Sunday and go into March Madness, the championship game, and the Final Four, of course, concluding the first week of April, right before the Masters. So it looks something like this, and it's pretty brutal. That's really the main point I wanted to drive home. If you thought Texas's Big 12 schedule was hard last year, it's going to be even harder this year. And there's one disappointing part about it. I'll get to that in a minute. January 6th, at home, we open the conference slate against Texas Tech. Texas Tech, again, really good basketball program. They had some drama this offseason. They had to fire their coach due to a lot of different reasons. They have a new coach there. Had some turnover, but that's a good basketball program up in Lubbock. They play hard. They play good defense. That's never an easy game for Texas. They have some good players. So open up with Texas Tech. Then you go at Cincinnati. I've yet to really dive into the depths of Cincinnati's basketball program, but they've had some good years in the past. And anytime you go on the road in the Big 12, it's never going to be easy. So you get at Cincinnati, then you go at West Virginia, a place where Texas has actually had some success. Of course, you had the drama with Bob Huggins this offseason at West Virginia. They now have a new head coach in place. That program's been kind of down from where it usually is the past couple of years, I think. But they're still, it's still hard to play in Morgantown. So you go at Cincinnati, at West Virginia, then UCF at home. UCF, again, another good basketball team. Baylor at home. Baylor's always really good. They're going to be really, really, really good again. Then you go at Oklahoma, a place where Texas has had success in the past, but again, Big 12 road games, never easy. At BYU, not going to be easy. Playing in Provo, Utah, playing those kids, they play really hard. Come home, play Houston in Kelvin Sampson's program with LJ Cryer, the Baylor transfer coming in there. We know they lost some really good players, but they just continue to reload through the transfer portal. Their recruiting has shot out of a cannon. So Houston at home, at TCU, Iowa State at home, West Virginia again at home, at Houston. So you have the home and home with Houston, which I really like. You get Houston to come to Austin before we leave the conference. We also have to go to Houston, which I like. Maybe I'll go to that game since I'm in Houston. Kansas State at home. Again, Jerome Tang. If you don't already know, he is factually one of the best coaches in college basketball with what he's done with that program. Taking that team to the brinks of the Final Four last year. They did lose 2 really, really good players to the NBA draft in Marquise Noel and Keontae Johnson, but they did some work through the transfer portal, and they're going to be really good again. He's he's next to Bill Self. He's up there with the best coaches in college basketball, and particularly in the Big 12 with Kelvin Sampson and others. Then you get at Kansas in Lawrence. So you get the 2 Kansas schools back-to-back, middle of February, at Texas Tech, at Kansas, at Texas Tech. That's brutal. Home for Oklahoma State, at Baylor. So you got Baylor at home January 20th. Then you go at Baylor March 4th, the second to last game of the regular season, and then at home against OU. The one big bummer about this is you don't get Kansas at home in your last year of the Big 12. The premier team in the Big 12, the defending national championship from 2 years ago, with a loaded roster coming into this season with Hunter Dickinson and others. You don't get them in Austin. That is a bummer. You don't get them to come to the Moody Center. you have to go to Lawrence. But Texas has had some success in Lawrence lately. And again, we remember they beat them a couple times last year, including on their way to winning the Big 12 championship. So, Big 12 tournament championship. They blew them out, I think, the last game of the regular season on that hot run that Texas ended up going on, where they were playing really good basketball. They blew out Kansas. But Kansas got a better team this year, I think. We'll dive deeper into that on one of these episodes soon. That is a brutal schedule. Now, most every team in the Big 12 is going to have a really tough time in conference play. If Texas can come out of this, how many conference games do they play? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, 16, 17, 18. Still 18 conference games. You're just not getting the home and home because the conference has expanded. Again, like every year, if Texas can play their way to, say, 10-8 in conference, above 500, 10 wins in this league, I mean, they'll likely, if they crush their non-conference, they have a couple tough games in their non-conference, but it's not as strong as it was last year. They're going to Wisconsin to play at Marquette. They have a couple other could be really tough games. They might play UConn early on in the season, but it's not nearly as strong as last year when they played Gonzaga and a lot of those other really good teams, Creighton, et cetera, et cetera. If they can really crush their non-conference play and give themselves a little more room for error going into this Big 12 schedule that I just mentioned, I mean, 2 with Houston, 2 with Baylor, 1 with Kansas. You get all of the other new teams in the Big 12, some of those games being on the road. You got to play K-State, Texas Tech, TCU, who could all have good basketball teams. You never know. I mean, it's not going to be easy. If you can play yourself 10 to 11 wins, that'd be absolutely fantastic for this schedule. Above 500 should be the expectation. I mean, I think Texas has got a really talented team. We'll dive deeper into that on a later episode. But the Big 12 only got stronger going into this year with the addition of Houston and the other 3 schools that we mentioned, UCF, BYU, and Cincinnati. So there it is. That was the news bit from today. Again, we'll continue to talk about that. We'll continue to look at the schedule. We'll continue to talk about Texas basketball team and a lot of other programs around the country as we start to look ahead to the college basketball season. We'll have deeper dives into each team and their rosters, their moves that they made, et cetera, what's important to this year, so forth. But with that, I'm going to slowly shift away from basketball for now, as we just covered the 2023-2024 Texas Conference basketball schedule, their Big 12 schedule. We had big recruiting news over the weekend in football. Now, as we know, Texas has their 2023 recruiting class on campus and currently making actually pretty big impact on the success that Texas has had so far in this football season. You know, the class with Arch Manning, Anthony Hill, C.J. Baxter, Jonte Cook, Derek Williams, Malik Muhammad, Colton Vasek, et cetera, et cetera. We've seen some of those guys play already and have big impacts on the success of this year's football team. So 2023 recruiting class has passed. Texas is now recruiting for the freshmen of next fall, the first class to be entered into the SEC. The first full class going into the SEC. They are now working on that. Signing day comes in sometime late December. We still have a couple, 3.5-ish months to go before we get there. But Texas has been working on this recruiting class here ever since, they finished up their 2023 recruiting class. And even before then, they've been working on recruiting these kids. And big news over the weekend as Texas landed another super blue chip prospect to this recruiting class, along with the guy who's been touted as the guy of this recruiting class, Colin Simmons, who we'll talk about more later on in another podcast as we start to bring in more recruiting content to this podcast. They landed consensus um, five-star offensive lineman, offensive tackle out of Mater Dei, one of the premier high school football programs in Santa Ana, California. I mean, one of the best high school football programs there is in the entire country. Um, they landed Brandon Baker, who, according to the 24/7 composite rankings, is a composite five-star. He's ranked number 25 overall nationally in the 24/7 composite, and he's a number 2 overall prospect in the state of California, and he currently plays right tackle for Mater Dei, and they're very, very good to great high school football program. This is a kid that was highly recruited. I mean, highly recruited. If you look at his offer list, he had offers from Georgia, Ohio State, Alabama. I mean, that's the big three right there. Auburn, Florida, Florida State, Miami, Michigan, Notre Dame, Oklahoma, Oregon, Penn State, Stanford, Tennessee, and USC. I mean, that's just the start of his offer list. One of the better offensive linemen in this group of kids in this recruiting class. Texas was able to land him, I think, Sunday night in a commitment, big time commitment. If we go through the 4 nationally recognized services that cover football recruiting and recruiting in general and other sports too, ESPN.com has him as a high 4-star, number 39 overall prospect nationally, and the number 2 overall player in the state of California. So again, ESPN high 4-star, number 39 nationally, number 2 in the state of California. Rivals.com has him as a high 4-star, number 28 overall nationally, and the number 3 overall player in the state of California. On3, which is another national recruiting website, they have him as a mid 4-star. They're actually a little lower on the totem pole as it pertains to Brandon Baker as a prospect. They have him as a mid 4-star, number 49 overall nationally, and number 3 in the state of California. And then 24/7 has him as a 5-star, number 24 overall nationally, and number 3 in the state of California. So bottom line is, this is a guy that was recruited by virtually almost every elite football program there is, including Texas, from Mater Dei out in California, 6'5", almost 300 pounds, at offensive tackle, playing right tackle for them. He was offered by Georgia, Ohio State, Alabama, Penn State, Florida State, Michigan, Notre Dame, Oklahoma, Texas, just to name a few, highly recruited. And he is considered a super blue chip prospect, meaning he is basically, by every measure, a high 4-star to a 5-star solidified prospect. I mean, the 24/7 composite, as I mentioned, has him as a 5-star. And if you look at where all 4 recruiting services have him, although not all of them have him as a 5-star yet, and of course his season's still playing out. His senior season at Mater Dei is still playing out, so he could actually move up on some of these services websites. But if you look at where all 4 services have Brandon Baker, he's basically a consensus top 40 prospect for this upcoming recruiting class, the 2024 recruiting class. And he's a high 4-star, 5-star guy. And if you look at what Coach Kyle Flood, Texas's offensive line coach, has been able to do ever since Sark took him with him to Texas when he was hired back in 2021 after they fired Tom Herman, the difference in this program right now, you are seeing it right here. This is a perfect example. It's the offensive line and the defensive line. People say, and this is like the biggest sign that you just don't know what you're talking about when it comes to Texas football. Texas has always had talent. They've always had talent. Why have they underachieved? Well, they have had talent, but they haven't had it in the most important spots, the offensive and defensive lines. They've had some talent, but they haven't had the requisite talent on the offensive and defensive lines to really compete at a very high level on a national scale for Big 12 championships, hell, for SEC championships, and for national championships. They've really flipped this, and it all started with that 2022 recruiting class when they landed Kelvin Banks, who's already an All-American. He's going to go top 5 in the draft when he's draft eligible, most likely, as long as he stays healthy. When they landed a guy like DJ Campbell, who's now in his second year and has just started to start for Texas this year and has been pretty good after a rough week 1. And a bunch of other, Cam Williams of the world, a bunch of other elite high 4-star, 5-star offensive line prospects. Again, 2023 wasn't as good, but they landed some good talent on the offensive line. Again, Kyle Flood goes back in, lands another elite prospect on the offensive line, and Brandon Baker from Mater Dei, I remind you, arguably the best high school football program in the entire country out in California. I mean, this kid is looked at as a top 40 consensus prospect nationally by all 4 recruiting services. He's playing right tackle for Mater Dei. He's got a good skill set, pretty polished as a football player, really good in pass protection, good frame, athletic, can get out and do some things with his athleticism and his frame and run blocking schemes. This is what you're seeing. The biggest myth, once again, that people say, and this is the clear sign they don't know what they're talking about when it comes to college football, is they will say, well, Texas has always had talent. Well, in a way, they're right. They've had talent, but they haven't had this talent. The talent that actually wins football games and allows you to be an elite program on the offensive and defensive lines. I mean, I think Texas has had 2 offensive linemen drafted in the past 10 to 15 years. And if you start looking at what they have now, we always talk about Kelvin Banks. I think we got to start talking about DJ Campbell as a guy that could be on that trajectory, although he just started basically playing for Texas from that same recruiting class as Kelvin Banks. And you look at some of the other guys on the Texas offensive line. Christian Jones has developed into a guy that looks like an NFL draft pick and an all Big 12 caliber player. You're going to start to see other guys like Cam Williams from past recruiting classes with Kyle Flood from the past 2 years step into big roles, particularly next year or if there's an injury this year. Now you get another bookend high-profile piece to add to this group, and you just continue to stack talent on this offensive line going into the SEC. This is what's going to allow Texas to compete at a high level in the SEC. And you're seeing the same thing on the defensive line, right? They just went out, they got Colin Simmons, the 5-star plus prospect, one of the best pass rushing prospects to come out of the state of Texas in at least a half decade. 5-star prospect from Duncanville High School, another elite high school football program on a national scale, not just in the state of Texas. You're seeing it live. DeAndre Robinson. This is why Sark and this coaching staff, this is where they have separated themselves. Recruiting on the offensive and defensive lines, and not just doing it 1 year and then forgetting about it. They are stacking these super blue chip prospects, these high 4-star and 5-star guys, year after year after year. So they just have stockpiled all this talent. And they'll be, sooner rather than later, if they keep continuing to do this, they'll be in a position much like Georgia, much like Alabama, where guys leave, they develop at Texas, they leave after 2 or 3 years, they go to the NFL, they get drafted, and boom, the next elite guy is ready to step up. That's where Sark, Kyle Flood, the rest of this coaching staff has separated themselves, and you're finally seeing the byproduct of it in year 3 under Steve Sarkisian, when Texas has inarguably one of the best offensive lines in the country, and that defensive line might be the best position group thus far on the entire team, the way that they're playing. So getting Brandon Baker to add to Colin Simmons as like the 2 cornerstones so far of this 2024 recruiting class, one on the defensive side of the football on the line of scrimmage, one on the offensive side of the football on the line of scrimmage. Amazing. Like, this is what it requires to go win in the SEC. So, great job. Once again, if there's one thing that we know about Steve Sarkisian and this coaching staff, they can recruit. They can recruit their fucking asses off. And they do it in the right places. Now, that's not to say that Tom Herman couldn't recruit. That's not to say that even Charlie Strong couldn't recruit. They got good players. Texas finished with top 15, even top 5 recruiting classes in some years. But you look at those recruiting classes, go back to 2018, 2017, those years, there weren't a whole lot of Kelvin Banks. There weren't a whole lot of Colin Simmons. There weren't a whole lot of DJ Campbell. There weren't a whole lot of, I don't know, whoever you want to name, Cam Williams. It was Xavier Worthy. It was Sam Ellinger. It was Devin Duvernay. It was Bijan Robinson. Great players, good players, talented players, but they built Texas teams the wrong way. Bad defensive lines of Texas teams pass, bad offensive lines, not good enough. Not good enough to compete at a high level like Texas is doing right now and is projected to continue to do the rest of this season going into the SEC. They didn't recruit guys like this. Guys that will win you football games and keep you rising as a football program going into the SEC and allow you to compete year in, year out. It's on the line of scrimmage, period. And if you disagree with that, get off my show. You don't know what you're talking about. I'm sorry, you don't. Go somewhere else. Texas has had talent, not to this level on the offensive and defensive lines, period. So, with all that being said, once again, to recap, Brandon Baker, according to the 24/7 composite rankings, composite 5-star. That's compiling all the rankings from the 4 recruiting services, putting them together. He's a 5-star prospect out of Mater Dei in California for the class of 2024, playing right tackle. Could be Christian Jones's replacement after Christian Jones leaves the program and potentially gets drafted after this year. We could see Kelvin Banks on the left side next year and Brandon Baker on the right side next year at the right tackle spot, his natural position. Texas has not had that. In my lifetime, I don't remember. Maybe when they won those national championships and were competing. But at least in the half decade, they had not had two elite prospects at the tackle positions like they have or are going to have potentially next year or the year after with Brandon Baker and Kelvin Banks. And then you have DJ Campbell, Cam Williams, all the other guys, the Connor Robertsons from these past recruiting classes under Kyle Flood, and the way that Kyle Flood develops talent. You saw it at Alabama. You're seeing it at Texas. Texas is going to have some really damn good offensive lines the next couple of years going into the foreseeable future. The same thing applies on the defensive line, and we'll talk more about the defensive line recruiting on a different episode. We'll talk way more about Colin Simmons and his skill set and some of the other elite prospects that Texas maybe has still yet to land in this recruiting class as they look to finish with another top 5, top 3 recruiting class once again. But to finish my recap, Brandon Baker, composite 5-star. He was offered by Georgia. He was offered by Ohio State. He was offered by Alabama. He was offered by Auburn. He was offered by Florida. He was offered by Florida State. He was offered by Miami. He was offered by Michigan. He was offered by Notre Dame. He was offered by Oklahoma. He was offered by Oregon. He was offered by Penn State. He was offered by USC. He was offered by Tennessee. He was offered by Stanford. Name a program, Brandon Baker was offered. This was a guy that Georgia wanted badly. They had him in on an official visit. This was a guy that Oregon wanted badly. Did you watch that offensive line? Did you watch that program this past weekend? Run all over Colorado. This was a guy that Ohio State wanted. This was a guy that Alabama and Nick Saban wanted. This was a guy that USC wanted. This was a guy that James Franklin and Penn State wanted. Have you watched that team run the football? This was a guy that Michigan, the team that has had the best offensive line, has won the award for the best offensive line in college football the past 2 years. This was a guy that they badly wanted. And he chose Texas because of what Kyle Flood and Steve Sarkisian are building. Also, NIL plays into this. I'm not going to lie to you. I mean, that plays a big factor as well. But when he committed, he said what he directly attributed his commitment to Kyle Flood and Steve Sarkisian and what Texas is building, what they have been building the past couple of recruiting classes, what you're continuing to see with guys like Anthony Hill stepping on campus and immediately being a disruptor on defense, with Malik Muhammad making some plays in the secondary as a high 4-star, 5-star type guy at the cornerback spot, with Derek Williams, who's been rotating more in at the safety position behind Jaron Thompson, behind Jalen Catalon, with, on the offensive side, you saw CJ Baxter. He's been hurt a little bit, banged up, but you saw him score a touchdown. You've seen him break off a couple really nice runs. You see his talent. You see Jonte Cook make that 50-yard catch this past weekend. I mean, we're just scratching the surface. This is what's going to separate Texas. This is what's going to bring Texas back. This is what's going to make Texas back. Particularly the breadth and the depth of the elite recruiting that Texas has done the past couple of years under Steve Sarkisian, and it continues, and it's going to continue. I mean, these high-profile recruits are going to continue to flood in for not only this upcoming year, the 2024 recruiting class, but 2025. I mean, if Texas has the year that we think it's going to have, Texas could do what A&M did a couple years back. They could have the number 1 recruiting class in the country next year. And just think about that, stacking that on top of what they've already done for 2024, 2023, and 2022. That's why it plays a big part into why I'm so excited about this football team and why this program as a whole. Sark and Kyle Flood, all the other coaches on this Texas football staff. I mean, Jeff Banks with the linebackers and the tight ends, the running backs coach, Uh, all the coaches, Blake Gideon with the secondary, and particularly the safeties, getting a guy like Derek Williams to come in, Kyle Flood on the offensive line. They've done a fantastic job. And they're doing it in a different way. They're building the team the right way. Tom Herman, Charlie Strong, good recruiters, could get talent, but not the right type of talent. Not the type of talent that elevates Texas to a place where they should be as a program. As perennial double-digit win team at the very least, like they were under Mac Brown. Winning conference championships occasionally at the very least, which they haven't done in a long, long time. Getting to New Year's Six Bowls, being in the playoff, contending for national championships. The standard of excellence at the University of Texas. This is what's going to play a big part in getting them there. It's not the only thing. Players have to execute. You got to develop these players. You got to build that culture, which I think Texas has as of right now. I mean, this team just is different. I think they're on a mission. I think they've sort of flipped that culture as a lot of the Tom Herman guys are now out of the program. Not all of them. There are still guys remaining, but they've gotten those guys to buy in. They've weeded out all the fat, if you will, and they have the meat in the, the meat of that. The guys who still want to be here and compete at a high level under Sark and have bought into his vision, and Pete Kwiatkowski and the defensive coordinator, guys like T'Vondre Sweat, David Binda, Byron Murphy. I mean, those guys are still here, and we've seen this coaching staff come in and start to develop those guys, make them better football players. Jahdae Barron's a perfect example in the secondary. Jalen Ford, not a Sark recruited guy. That was Tom Herman. And you got to give Tom Herman credit for getting those guys, for getting T'Vondre Sweat, for getting Byron Murphy, for getting Jalen Ford. But it's been Sark and this coaching staff that he's put around him to start to actually elevate those guys to be better football players, which I don't believe Tom Herman and that staff did a very good job of. Just being honest with you. But overall, man, landing Brandon Baker, huge. What they're doing on the offensive and defensive lines is what's going to, again, bring them to that elite level as a program once again. So, and there, as I mentioned, there are other things involved. You got to have the culture. You got to have the development. You got to be able to go out and pick your spots in the transfer portal nowadays to fill roster holes, get more experience, et cetera, et cetera. And Texas has done a good job of that and will continue to do that. You got to use NIL. Texas, I mean, they have basically unlimited funds at this point in NIL. They're one of the powerhouses in NIL. It's really exciting what's happening. It is. It's really exciting. And if you don't believe that, once again, if you don't believe that what Sark and this coaching staff is doing is different than what coaching regimes of past at Texas have done, I don't know what to tell you. I don't know what to tell you. So that's that. About 45 minutes in. Thank you to our one listener, whoever that might be, tuning in at 11:15 p.m. on a Tuesday night. Thank you very much. That's my recruiting spiel for tonight. We talked about the Big 12 basketball schedule at the beginning. It's brutal. We talked a little bit about Texas basketball and what we're going to be talking about over the next 4 to 5 weeks as we look into the college basketball season. I wanted to do this State of the Nation because we're 1/3 of the way through the Texas football regular season. I'll do part of that, but I don't want to go too long since it's already almost 11:30. But what I'll do actually is we know that this Texas defense in particular has been performing at a really, really high level so far this year. I think preseason we talked about this defense potentially being top 30, top 25 level in the country just because of the returning talent and some of the guys that they had recruited, guys that had been in place from the start of spring ball to fall camp to step into bigger roles. Some of these younger players that they have recruited, we thought, or I at least thought, this defense could be top 30, top 25 level. Now, the one caveat I'll give y'all is I don't think Texas has played even a really good quarterback yet. I think Jalen Milroe at Bama, by the time we get to the end of the season, we could look back and say, oh, well, he's a really good quarterback. But I don't think he's developed into that yet. I don't think he's gained enough experience. I think he's still trying to figure things out, work out the kinks in that Alabama offense. Outside of him, I mean, he's talented, but I wouldn't call him a really good college football quarterback yet. Like I would say a Quinn Ewers or a Michael Penix Jr. or a Caleb Williams, the elite of the elite guys. He's definitely not in that class. I wouldn't even put him up there with, Bo Nix, like the really, really good college football quarterbacks that are leading really, really good college football programs yet. JT Daniels at Rice, Sawyer Robertson. I mean, no offense, but to Baylor, but their backup quarterback, not very good. We saw that if you watched the game on Saturday. Made some nice throws, not totally void of talent. I mean, he was a 4-star recruit out of high school. So he's not – I think he's just, one, in a bad situation, and two, he's a backup. So he hasn't had a whole lot of experience, but on the season, he's completing under 50% of his passes. Just not very good yet as a college quarterback. And then whoever we faced against Wyoming actually did a pretty good job considering he was a backup, but not guys. Those are not like, you don't look at that and say, oh, well, Texas has faced some really, really good quarterbacks and this defense is absolutely kicking ass. Well, they are kicking ass, and I'm going to give you some numbers to prove that, which is good. But I think the tests are upcoming in these coming weeks. Jalen Daniels at Kansas, real quarterback. He's a guy that walked into DKR 2 years ago and hung 58 on Texas's ass. Really, really good football player. One of the more underrated quarterbacks in the country. Texas has to be ready. It's going to be a step up in competition at the quarterback spot. The next week, they did not face Dylan Gabriel in last year's Red River game. No, they did not. He's been playing really well. He's a really good college quarterback, transferring from UCF a couple of years ago under Brent Venables. Oklahoma looking good in year 2. After what was not so great of a season last year, they lost 49-0. He's going to be a bigger test than what they've faced so far. And then we start looking down the line at what Texas could potentially face. There are some other pretty good quarterbacks mixed in there, not to look too far ahead. But the next 2 weeks will serve as a bigger test, especially from a quarterback standpoint for this Texas defense than, say, the past couple of weeks at the start of the season. But to give Texas credit, they have been about as good as you can be as a defense for who they have played up until for these first 4 weeks. For the first third of the regular season, they've been an elite defense. I'll give you some numbers. I have the rankings nationally in about 10 different categories as it pertains to this defense. Just listen to this. Third down defense, they're 17th. First downs allowed, they're 16th. Interceptions, they're 12th in the country, 12th most. Red zone defense, and this is really, really impressive, they're second. Rushing defense, they're 18th. Sacks, which is an area that this Texas defense has historically struggled with, they're 18th. Scoring defense, they're 12th. Team passing efficiency, opponent passing efficiency, they're 24th. Turnover margin, they're 16th. And yards allowed per game, they're 24th. So basically what that tells you is, from a national rankings perspective, from the production that we've seen from this defense so far, this Texas defense is playing no worse than a top 25 defense in the country. And in most of those categories, they're playing like a top 20 defense in the country. In 8 of those 10 categories, they're ranked 18th or better. So from just a number standpoint, men lie, women lie, numbers don't lie. Texas is playing like a top 18 defense in the country for the most part. Top 20 defense, let's say. That's really good. That's a big difference from years past. They're doing a good job stopping the run. Vernon Broughton, Byron Murphy, Tavondre Sweat, Ethan Burke, Anthony Hill with his speed at the linebacker position, Jalen Ford. Teams have not been able to run the ball effectively on Texas. We've seen some big runs. We've seen a couple drives where it hasn't been as good. But for the most part, this Texas defense has done a good job stopping the run. They are forcing more turnovers. They're being more disruptive in the secondary. They become a much better tackling team. They're more disciplined defensively. They're not allowing the big plays. They're just doing everything that you want as a defense, including, I think, maybe the most important thing, they're getting off the field more on third downs. And when teams do get into the red zone, they're not allowing them to score touchdowns. They're forcing field goals, not touchdowns. Really good so far. Not a whole lot you can nitpick, if at all. Even guys like David Binda make David Binda, Jet Bush, Anthony Hill. Just name a guy in the Texas defense. He's making an impact. But there are bigger tests coming. I'll just warn you. Jalen Daniels and Dylan Gabriel the next 2 weeks before we get to the bye week. They're going to serve as a little bit of a step up in competition, particularly at the quarterback position, than Texas has faced the first 4 weeks of the season. And then again, I will say, Jalen Milroe, we could look back at that Alabama game at the end of the year and say, wow, Texas beat that guy on the road. But I don't think quite yet we can say that Jalen Milroe has solidified himself as a really good college football quarterback. So they've done what they need to do. I think Pete Kwiatkowski deserves a raise for what he's done with this Texas defense. Bo Davis with what he's done with that defensive line. Jeff Choate with what he's done with those linebackers. Blake Gideon with what he's done with those corners in this secondary, the safeties in particular. This whole defensive coaching staff as a collective has done a great job developing this talent, getting them on the field, putting them in the right positions that are advantageous to winning. Pass rush is better. Run defense is better. The discipline overall is better. Guys that weren't producing at a high level under Tom Herman are now producing at a high level. It's a more cohesive effort defensively. Guys aren't out of positions as much. They're not allowing the big play. They're making plays in the secondary occasionally, forcing turnovers, getting sacks, getting to the quarterback, finishing, not allowing touchdowns. It's been really good so far defensively. And at times so far, the offense has looked a bit clunky. It hasn't been the huge explosion of offense quite yet that we thought it might be from this Texas team at the beginning of the season. I think we could still see that. I think this Texas offense is capable of that, but we haven't seen it yet. I mean, we saw good effort at Bama. We saw a really good effort this past week against Baylor, but there were times against Rice where they struggled to move the ball. For the first 3 quarters against Wyoming, it was bad. I mean, it just was. They got it going in the fourth quarter, and they've gotten it going when they've absolutely needed to, but it hasn't been the complete effort, the complete explosion from all this offensive talent on a consistent basis that we expected coming in. And the defense has allowed the offense to sort of slowly come along in games because they're not allowing the other teams to sustain drives, to convert third downs, to get in the end zone, to put up points, to take time off the clock, to run the football. I just laid out the data for you. 17th in third downs, 12th in interceptions, 2nd in red zone defense, 18th in rushing defense, 18th in sacks, 12th in scoring defense, 24th in yards allowed per game, 24th in opposing team passing efficiency, 16th in turnover margin, 16th in first downs allowed. Really, really good so far. There are bigger tests on the way. We'll talk more about Kansas, the Kansas game tomorrow night. We'll also talk more about the other games across the country. Again, it's not as loaded as last week, but it's a really, really good college football slate. For the real college football fans that know what they're talking about, it's a really, really good college football slate once again this weekend. Of course, a lot of the country is going to have their eyes on how Colorado rebounds from that beatdown in Eugene this past Saturday as they welcome in USC to Boulder. That should be interesting. We, of course, had the Texas-Kansas game. We have another ranked matchup going on with Ole Miss hosting LSU. That should be interesting. LSU just got a really big test from Arkansas last week in one of the more underrated games of the weekend that not a whole lot of people were paying attention to because they were watching Notre Dame, Ohio State, and rightfully so. There are some other good games. Georgia's playing Auburn. South Carolina's playing Tennessee. There are other good games. We'll talk about it all tomorrow. And we'll get more into maybe some recruiting, maybe some college basketball. We're going to dive into our first 1 or 2 programs tomorrow as we look ahead to the college basketball season. So we'll be live. Haven't decided the exact time yet, but I will announce it tomorrow on our social media. And then Emmy and I will have one more episode out before the end of this week as we look ahead to the baseball playoffs, which start next week or this upcoming week. The regular season, the long-ass regular season in baseball finally ends on Sunday night, and we'll get some postseason baseball. We have the Ryder Cup this weekend. If you love golf, that is going to be awesome. We did our draft a couple days ago. You can go find that on our YouTube channel or on our social media. And make sure you tune in live every Sunday night for our NFL recaps. We've done it the first 3 weeks. We did it last night. And we'll continue to do that. So like and subscribe to the channel. Like and subscribe to this particular part of the channel. Continue to tune in as I'll be talking Texas sports and other college sports at least twice a week on our channel and on this platform. Thank you to our one viewer who has tuned in for most of the show. I greatly appreciate that. And we'll be back tomorrow for another episode of Deep in the Heart of Longhorn Sports for episode 21. This is Michael Ween signing off. Hook 'em horns. Enjoy your evening and see you next time.